Hello and welcome! Are we even conscious, or is this all an illusion? Today we are going to talk about consciousness. We will cover several parts. So first of all, we talk about consciousness, self, and the heart problem which is connected to it. Then we talk about attention. Next about the binding problem, which is namely how the experience is in unity, although there are different qualities like color and hue and shape, movement. They are all different qualities, but we experience them as one. How is that possible? Next, we talk about the self as well as about free will. And last but not least, we talk about animal consciousness and then about the function. Okay, so I would say let's start with consciousness itself. Consciousness is in general a point of view and experience. There's also something like how is it like to be this organism, this being. So therefore we can differentiate between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is about how something is like to be. Like it has qualia, it is what it is likeness. Access consciousness, on the other hand, is more about rational thoughts, about goal-directed action. So if you think back about the mind-body problem, we came to the conclusion that a materialistic explanation is necessary to explain the mind-body problem. However, we also have to think about how does the materialistic way of thinking or explanation, materialistic explanation, answers the question about phenomenal and access consciousness. We have three different paths we can go. Either we say it's a hard problem of consciousness, we can say it's an epistemological gap, which means that we lack the capacities, the cognitive capacities to explain it. Or we simply say, okay, materialism is wrong. We can't explain it with it because it's simply not right. This is the metaphysical gap. In terms of the materialistic way of explaining it, we can also say that this is an objective way of seeing it. But consciousness itself is subjective, so it's totally left out. So this is why we could say, okay, maybe our way of explaining it, the materialistic way, isn't right because it's not even possible to include this subjective view of consciousness. So maybe it's the course that we really don't have the cognitive abilities to think about. At this stage, I want to introduce three thought experiments. Firstly, the Mary's thought experiment, then the philosopher's zombie, and the zombie thought experiment. The Mary's thought experiment is about Mary, who is somebody who studies everything about color. She lives in a black and white room for her whole life, and she doesn't know anything or hasn't seen color itself, but she knows everything from the start to beginning about the retina and how we perceive color and everything. And then what happens is she gets outside to the outside world and experiences color. And then the question arises, what happens? So is she surprised about what color really is? Does she learn something new like qualia? Or is she not that surprised because she already knew all things about it? And actually, she isn't surprised because this is a philosopher's syndrome that we lack imagination. So as we know that she knows everything about it, she also has the expectation of how color looks. Next, we have the philosopher's zombie, which is basically a theory which says that there's a double with the double of you, but which doesn't have consciousness. So the question arises, what's the function of consciousness actually? Because this creature is also capable of living, of acting as you do, but just without consciousness. This is also what is talked about in the zombies thought experiment, because in this thought experiment we have a parallel universe in which everything is physical, so we don't have mental states, we don't have consciousness, but still everything works the same as here. So the question arises again, what is consciousness' purpose? What is its function? But there are some problems to it. So first of all, the existence of this parallel universum with zombies is very, very unlikely. Second of all, there's dualism, which is as a premise to this whole thought experiment, which is very problematic because it's unscientific. And lastly, we have phenomenal consciousness, which is about something, and that it has to do with the brain and therefore has a function. So really, these thought experiments don't get into the core sense of what consciousness is about, because it has a function, and in our lives there is consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, which is about something, right? Okay, so let's move on to consciousness itself. Consciousness has several definitions. We can talk about it as awareness, as attention, as feelings, emotions, states, which can be like come back to in later times. So we have different ways of approaching consciousness. This is why we have the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And also we have different ways to approach it. So first of all, we could say, okay, it's insoluble. We can't talk about it because, well, we don't have the cognitive capacities to talk about it, to explain it, to understand it. So let's just not deal with it, which is a pessimistic view, of course, but it is what it is, you know. Then we could say, okay, let's try to solve it. We could take other sciences into consideration, like physics and philosophy and biology, and like have a natural method, like taking different sciences into account and trying to combine them to find solutions to the hard problem of consciousness. Next, we could say, okay, when there are hard problems, then there could also be easy problems. And how about tackling them first? Maybe if we tackle the easy problems, which we can like solve with our method and our knowledge about science, which we have right now, maybe then we also get an easier solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Then another pessimistic view is, okay, we can't talk about the hard consciousness itself, hard problem of consciousness itself, because there's not just one hard problem, but several ones. So we can't just say, okay, we have to deal with this one, because there are other ones which we have to deal with as well. And then another view is, okay, simply saying, okay, it's not existent. Okay, there is just not a hard problem of consciousness. This is basically saying, okay, consciousness doesn't exist. Okay, so we have brain states, we have actions and feelings and thoughts, but there's no consciousness in between. Okay, this is a grand illusion. So it is not like how we always think about it as it is, but it is different. There is no consciousness. There are actions, there are thoughts, there are feelings, but there's no consciousness. One example is vision. As we, for example, have gaps in our blind side because of the optic nerve, where there aren't any receptors. And then these gaps are filled by the brain. Or we have saccades, or blind side, where we don't actually see something or see something and can't remember it, but the brain still merges this into a picture or a perception. Next, I want to talk about attention. There's several ways of approaching attention. Namely, there's the full conception. Secondly, there's reductionism. Thirdly, there's anti-reductionism. And last but not least, there's eliminate. Well, what basically full conception says is that we have like a spotlight. Attention works like a spotlight. We have different sensations. Then there comes attention, which says, okay, we want to pick this one and perceive it. We want to take this one and I want to perceive now the pencil. There are different things in this picture right now. So you see the background, the foreground, me, my clothing, the pencil, the hand moving, and your attention says, okay, I want to perceive the face of this person. I want to perceive the pencil right now. This is a full perception. However, there are some problems to it, as there are different ways and different kinds of attention. For example, it's passive or active, focal or global. So it's hard to think about if there's really a unified way to approach attention. This is also kind of what reductionism is about, As reductionism says, okay, attention selects the information which is processed, okay? So there's a so-called competitive bias, which says, okay, attention selects it and has a bias for higher level cognitive process. Then we have anti-reductionism, which is basically about different forms of attention and takes them seriously. We can divide this up into different paths, different views, which is the structuring view, which basically says that attention structures our conscious experience. On the other hand, we have the rational axis view, which is more about the distinction about phenomena and axis consciousness, and also about how it actually feels. So we have these different parts, these different views on consciousness and attention, and therefore these different parts are taken seriously. But this is actually the problem about it, because there's no unified theory about attention, and therefore it doesn't really take science seriously. And then lastly we have eliminativism, which says, okay, drop this whole concept of attention, okay? So we have actions, we have thoughts, we have feelings, everything, but basically there's no attention which, well, forms, structures it, okay? But this is a problem, because we have to think about attention, we have to think about conscious experience, we have to explain experiences and also our experiences about consciousness. And this is also this is just possible with talking about attention. Okay, next to the binding problem. First of all, what is the binding problem? Basically it says, okay, we have different qualities like motion, movement, color, shape, everything, but we unify it into unity, like we have one experience of it instead of different experiences. So how is this possible? First of all, we can subdivide the binding problem into disunity, which we have, for example, at unity, which we have, for example, at split brain patients, in which the corpus callosum, so the connection between the two hemispheres, is cut. So then the question arises, do we have like two consciousness or two selves, or how does it work? But this is a mereological fallacy, because we say, okay, consciousness can be attributed to certain parts of the brain, but this is probably not likely, because mostly we think about it as being part of a whole organism. Another path is super unity, which we have, for example, with synesthesia, which is that different senses work together-ish. So for example, there's an example of a girl who, when she listens to music and closes her eyes, she also sees colors. Okay, so these two senses coexist and also co-work, kind of. And to solve the body problem, we have three approaches. First is dualism. Second is a materialistic way of approaching it. And thirdly, it's again unity as an illusion. So let's start with dualism. Dualism basically is very problematic, because it says, okay, we have two substances, and the immaterial mind gives us this sense of unity. But as we know from videos before about mind-body problem, we know that dualism is very highly problematic, as there's this interaction problem and God comes into existence, and therefore it's not really scientific. Next we have the materialistic viewpoint, which basically says, okay, the mind and the body as a unity form this unity, also in response and in interaction with the environment. Last but not least, we have unity as an illusion. So we can say everything we have, like actions and thoughts and feelings, we think of it as a unity, but actually it isn't. Like, there are different parts to it, and unity doesn't really exist. There's the metaphor of the fridge, for example, which says, okay, there is only unity when we pay attention to it. So every time we pay attention to it, there's unity, but other than that, there's no unity at all. Next, I want to talk about the self, and there are mainly two theories which deal with the self, and namely the ego theory, which states that there is actually a self, so we feel there is a self because there actually is one. And opposing to that, there's the bundle theory, which says, okay, it feels like there is a self, but actually that's an illusion, so there isn't one. And then there are four approaches towards the self, and using this ego and bundle theory, we try to explain them. So we have one example about the ego theory, which is a neuroscientific model, and then the bundle theory has different approaches, which is firstly the inactive and extended theory, second of all the narrative theory, and thirdly there's a phenomenal self model of a guy called Metzinger. Okay, so what does the neuroscientific model says about the self? So it is in favor of the ego theory and says there is a self which is like localized in the brain, somewhere materialistically localized in the brain. But then on the other hand, we have the bundle theory, and the inactive and extended theory, which says, okay, the self emerges out of the interaction with the environment. So, for example, in social interactions, when somebody perceives me, I exist, the self exists. But other than that, it doesn't really have an identity which exists throughout your life. Then the narrative theory says, okay, the self emerges out of storytelling. So every time we tell about our life, there is a self to it. But other than that, there is no self. It's an illusion. And then Metzinger says, okay, the self emerges, as well as the inactive and extended theory says, okay, by the interaction with the environment and how we perceive the world. But we don't perceive the world fully as we maybe think we do, because many things which are unconsciously perceived or sensed are not really perceived. So we don't really perceive the world ourselves, because we just have a small part of attention and a small part we really perceive. Next, I want to talk about free will. Again, there are different approaches. First, we have determinism, then also hard determinism and dualism, libertinism and compatibilism. Determinism says, okay, everything which happens in the future is determined. It doesn't really say by what, but it is determined. So we don't have a free will, as we can say, okay, determinism is true, so we don't have actions which we will consciously act out of ourselves. And thirdly, we can say, okay, then free will doesn't exist. Then we have hard determinism, which says, okay, we have determinism which isn't compatible with free will. So therefore we can say free will doesn't exist. However, there is, for example, quantum physics, which says, okay, we maybe don't really know what there is and how the atoms are structured, so we can't really say it's determined before. However, randomness doesn't really say free will, doesn't it? And a second thing is, okay, that these theories, so also hard determinism, has to explain our phenomenology, so how it feels like, and it doesn't do that. Then we have dualism and determinism, which basically says, okay, we have two separate substances, the mind and the body, and the soul acts on its own without being determined by nature. But again, dualism isn't scientific, so we can cross that out of our thoughts about free will. Libertinism is a way of saying, okay, there is actually free will. So we can say determinism isn't compatible with free will, but however, we could have done otherwise, okay? So we could have then done something differently. So therefore we could say, okay, there is something like free will, but to be really honest, we can't really say determinism is wrong, because this really seems unscientific, doesn't it? Then we have compatibilism, which basically says, okay, there is free will and there's determinism. So everything is determined, and we can act on our own. But which doesn't really make sense, because then free will and the notion of free will is changed, which just starts another discussion about it, and we don't talk about the same thing. Then we have Benjamin Libet's experiment, which gives us an answer about if we will actually have free will. So we have an EEG on our skull, and we are supposed to do something like grab a pencil. Then we should say, when is our conscious will to grab the pencil? And then also the readiness potential in the brain is measured by the EEG. So what we can see is that 300, on average 350 milliseconds before the conscious will, before the conscious decision, there is readiness potential in the brain. So before we actually say, okay, I consciously want to do that, the brain says, okay, we are going to do that. And after that, the movement comes and we actually grab the pencil. So we could ask the question, is there actually a function to free will? So we can ask the question, is there any role to the conscious function? We can say, okay, there's no free will, because our actions are driven by the brain processes which are before our consciousness kicks in. One reaction comes from materialists, which say, okay, well, we are not surprised about that, for sure, because we know that brain processes are the cause of our behavior, right? So we don't really have to say, okay, well, wow, what did you tell us? Because we are not surprised about that. And maybe the free will isn't about, okay, we actually consciously want to do that, but about what we do not do. So even when there's readiness potential in our brain, we can consciously say, okay, we don't want to do that. Maybe this is the function of free will. We are approaching the end mostly, and we are talking about animal consciousness, and in this sense we also talk about the mindless design. So the question arises, how does the organism and its environment, this good fit, how does it arose? So we can say, okay, it's an accident. It just came from nowhere. Then we can say, okay, maybe it's a directed design, which says that there is an intelligent designer, like a god maybe, who designed everything in a directed way. And then we can also say there's a mindless design, which says, okay, it's not an accident, but there are other reasons why this emerged. And for example, this could be evolution with natural selection, which comes for sure from Darwin. And we can also take Mendel into the consideration. And we can say, okay, it's probably not directed, because as we know from natural selection, not every trait is beneficial, right? So if there's a God who wants everything good for us, then why does he do something like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, everything like that, or war, or whatever? It's more about the organisms, right? So probably it's not direct. Now let's come to animal consciousness, and there are different approaches to think about if animals have a mind. So first of all, there are physical and behavioral indicators. So we can say, for example, that consciousness is connected to the brainstem and the thalamus. So every creature who has a brainstem and a thalamus is also conscious. In terms of behavioral indicators, we have complex behavior. So when we see that if an animal does complex behavior, we can say, okay, this is probably due to consciousness. Next, we have self-recognition. And there's a mirror self-recognition test in which, for example, a chimpanzee goes into a mirror and then you see the reaction. Does he really think, okay, this is me, or is this another chimpanzee, right? When it recognizes itself, we can say, okay, there is self-recognition, there is like self-consciousness. In the debate about the self, if we say, okay, the self is illusionary, then self-recognition isn't really possible. So we can't say in these terms that there is self-conscious. Next we can say, okay, there's something like mind reading, so that animals think about other creatures in terms of different ways of communicating, and also think about them as having also a mind. So seeing other animals, they also think that they have a mind. Last but not least, we have imitation, which is basically also a way of complex behavior. So we have to say, well, imitating something and learning from it is a kind of complex behavior, which is probably due to consciousness. Okay guys, so we are almost at the end, but I just want to talk about the functions of consciousness. The first approach is inessentialism. So we can say that consciousness arises somehow but doesn't have like a causal effect on physical behavior. Then we can say, okay, consciousness itself doesn't have an independent function. So mental states and consciousness together, they have a function, but consciousness itself really doesn't have a function. Then we can say, okay, maybe consciousness has adaptive functions. So consciousness is used in natural selection, for example, in the evolution. So it can act on it and can also change. This is maybe a reason why it is there. But to be really specific, we could say, okay, it doesn't really play on this overall brain state which has something to do with consciousness, but it's more about the subjective experiences on which natural selection works. Lastly, we have illusion. Okay, we can say that consciousness is just illusory, so it doesn't really exist. And why does it really exist or exist in our head? Why is this phenomenology existent? Is because it works on memes. Memes are like behavioral and cultural elements which form our, well, idea of consciousness. Okay guys, we've covered a lot. That's amazing. Good job for staying on so long and being present. I just want to have a quick recap. So we talked about consciousness itself, and talking about consciousness and explaining phenomenological consciousness and access consciousness. We had the hard problem, we had the epistemological gap and the metaphysical gap, which basically said, okay, maybe we are not smart enough, not consciously ready enough to explain what consciousness is about, but maybe also the materialistic view is wrong. We talked about 3 thought experiments, the Mary's thought experiments, which basically says, okay, there isn't more to it than, well, just knowing about every aspect of, for example, vision. And then we had the philosopher's zombie and the zombie thought experiment, which says, okay, maybe there's another universe in which everything is physical and there's no consciousness, but it still works. So what is the function of consciousness? We basically have a hard problem of consciousness. So we can say, okay, we can't solve it. We can try to solve it using different sciences. We can tackle the easy problems first. It's not just one hard problem, which is basically a pessimistic view. And we can say, okay, it's not existent. It has to do with the grand illusion. Next, we talked about attention. So we have the thought conception, which says, okay, there's probably a spotlight. Reductionism, which says, okay, maybe attention structures our perceptions and sensations. Then we have anti-reductionism, which says, okay, there are different forms and different views on attention. And eliminativism, which basically says, okay, there's no such thing as attention. Then we talked about the binding problem. How is it possible that we perceive different qualities as a unity? We have 2 different ways of expressing the binding problem in disunity and superunity. These are 2 examples. And then we have 3 different ways of approaching a dualism, which is highly problematic because it's not scientific. Then the materialistic view, which basically says, okay, the body and the mind in reaction to the environment cause this feeling of unity. And then, okay, unity is an illusion. So we basically say, well, it's not really there, it's not how we actually think about it. Then we talk about the self. And we have two theories. The ego theory saying, okay, it feels like there's a self because there actually is a self. And then the bundle theory, which says, okay, it feels like there's the self, but really it's an illusion. There isn't a self. We have a neuroscientific model which says, okay, there's a self because there are different brain parts which are associated with the self. And we have three different ways to approach the bundle theory, namely the negative and extended theory, the narrative theories, which says, okay, in the interaction with the environment and talking about our lives, we make up a self, it creates a self, but there's not a constant entity of a self. And then we have Metzinger's view as well. Let's talk shortly about free will. We have different ways to approach it. Determinism, which says, okay, everything we do in the future is already determined, which is probably the case as we saw with the Benjamin Libet's experiment, because the brain states and brain processes determine what happens. Then dualism says, okay, maybe the soul, the immaterial soul, acts on the free will, it's the course of physical behavior, but this is inscientific. Hard determinism says, okay, determinism is true, therefore we don't have a free will. Libertarianism says, okay, determinism is actually false, so we have a free will, we can act on it, we can act otherwise as we wanted to. But to say determinism is false seems to be quite unscientific. And then we have compatibilism, which is really, let's say, nonsense, because it says free will and determinism can be like put together in a box and are compatible, but really they are not, like really logically. Then we talked about the mindless design, then that it can be an accident that the environment and the organism are such a good fit. Then it can be directed, which is probably not the case, as natural selection shows, because not every trait is beneficial. And then we have the mindless design, which is shown in the evolution and natural selection, which we see from Darwin, and I could take Mendel also into it. Coming to the end, we talked about animal consciousness, and there are 4 ways to approach it. Basically, talking about physical and behavioral indicators, as well as imitation, which are complex ways to behave, and therefore we could say it comes from consciousness. Physical indicators are that we have a brainstem and a thalamus, which shows or which is active when we are conscious. So we could say every organism which has a brainstem and a thalamus is probably also conscious. Self-recognition can be a sign for consciousness, as it includes self-consciousness, and mind reading is also kind of complex thinking about thinking, and knowing or thinking about the selves of and consciousness of others. Last but not least, we talk about the functions of consciousness. So we have essentialism, that there's no independent function, adaptive functions, and that consciousness itself is an illusion. Okay guys, I really want to thank you that you watched this video. I hope it helped you. If you're a Tilburg University student, I hope it helped you studying for the exam, or just having a summary and connecting the bits in a different way. I wish you all luck with the exam. If you're just a regular person who is interested in this video, then good job for keeping up. Consider subscribing and maybe leave a comment how you liked it, if you want to see other videos like that, or if you have different topic recommendations. I would really love to hear about that. And other than that, I would say see you next time.